So this was just a simple attempt to dramatise the categorical difference between addition and multiplication. So then we spent time discussing how you'd most effectively do this, just in terms of creating a model, as well as the more important, more interesting issue as to could this ever be a piece of art, or is it always just going to be the sort of thing you find in a science museum?
I mean, I think at this point it's fair to say that we got quite excited and Conrad went a bit quiet. So I think it'd be interesting to hear, Conrad, what were you thinking when we began to make this thing, and how did it reflect on this? This
I suppose I don't know. It was quite interesting for me because I'm used to being quite the sort of egotistical artist working on my own and just pushing forwards on my own. So that was initially sort of. I was being led by this idea, which was kind of I'm not used to in that sense. I was interested in by it, and I wanted. At first, I was thinking, well, I don't know, we're going to make this artwork that's going to be pretty boring and kind of it's going to be a model rather than being. It's not going to create problems. It's going to be a demonstration of this thing, and I didn't think that in itself was going to be that interesting. And I thought that also it might be a bit clunky because we're going to try and do this thing that was going to go back and forth between these two things. And I was just worried about the way it was going to be realised. But then there was this enthusiasm, and I did like the idea of this branching effect with this system because it sort of had a sort of timeline that's from this drawing is going from right to left, right on the one over there is branching from left to right. And it sort of had this sort of branching system which was a sort of linear, but there was a sort of time element which I liked about it. So I thought actually this is actually good. We'll make this model and then I will just respond to it or we'll sort of try and work out, bend it or twist it into something that's maybe more ambiguous. I mean, for me, there's the interest in a piece of work or the success of a conceptual piece of art is in its breadth of interpretation and the possibilities of interpretation, and there's a certain depth of the author that I would like that is a sort of measure of the success of a piece for me, and that I really relinquish control of it once I sort of finish it. And so for this, for Matthew, it's sort of the sort of conveyance of the idea is sort of paramount, and that ambiguity is the sort of enemy of his intent.
I think this was one of the major differences.
This was kind of this was the sort of real sort of obstacle we were getting to. But so there was lots of basically there was this. It sort of came out of a dinner we had on Wednesday after a talk I gave in Penzance, and we were talking about. And I've always been preoccupied on a basic level, and in a sort of philosophical way, but not coming at it from an expert of mathematics, but just an epistemological and philosophical concern about numbers. And I've made pieces that are about specific ratios of numbers that basically look at music in an aesthetic way rather than in a visual way. And so there's been a lot of sort of that kind of philosophical, metaphysical look at what a 9 is to an 8 and what is a 7 to a 5. I've read a lot of books on sort of things, say the history of zero, or the kind of these sort of Kaplan books, or Sadie Plant's zeros and ones, and these sort of preoccupations. The history of number is really interesting to me, and one of the things that sort of happened, and again it was really just out of this fruitful exchange, was that I saw that the actual one of the things we were dealing with, and in a way we just needed to be more objective about what we were looking at, because with numbers, we're so familiar with them, we're so conditioned to use them in our everyday life that we can't really think about what they are anymore, because they're sort of such an inbuilt mechanism, and that it took us years when we were children to learn numbers, because actually they're very complicated things, and you learn them by rote, or you have a more innate sort of gift about what they really are. But most people just learn them by rote, but they are actually, the more you think about it, the more kind of the whole kind of idea of them collapses. But I think what I thought was actually what we should try and do, in a way, like when you're looking at linguistics, if you write in Chinese about English, it's sort of easier than writing about English in English. We needed to create a kind of objective platform to look at it. And so instead of using some other sort of abstract system of numbers, I was thinking about sort of primeval man and what that would be like to experience the first time to think about a number, and the sort of collective nouns of animals came up in discussion, and it was something that is they're quite humorous, because they were actually in the 14th century. This woman wrote this whole sort of list of quite fanciful and poetic names for animals, like parliament of geese or something. I don't know.
Parliament of Owls.
A parliament of owls, or a pride of a lion. There's all these sort of fanciful terms which are a bit distracting. They're quite funny, but they're a bit distracting to the actual fact that there are a lot of types of animal names that go back to real Anglo-Saxon kind of like, and I was interested in the fact that some groups of animals represented, some terms for these collective nouns represented specific numbers of animals. So like we went through the sort of dictionary and did a bit of research and found most of them refer to a group of animals but not a specific number. But I was interested in the idea of if you were a primeval man and you just had a tiny community of people in some remote kind of wilderness in England or anywhere in the world for that matter, and you were confronted by a couple of rabbits that came by every evening at dusk. They ran past your field and they kind of went, and you didn't know what, but you always saw them as these two. I'm trying to avoid the word two, but you had this amount of animals went past, or at dawn these three hawks would fly over your head, and they would fly over your head every night, or for 7 days they'd fly over your head, and you would call that, you wouldn't have an idea of numbers because no one had taught you numbers, and you had no use of numbers because you had no trading and you had no need for them, you had no consciousness of what a number was. So you would call that family of animals that existed together a name, and so for example a brace of rabbits is 2 rabbits. It refers to a specific number of rabbits, and a lease of hawks is 3 hawks. And so you'd have these, and then there's another one that says solitude of boar, and boar is one of, and it was really difficult to find an animal, a collective noun, a singular of boar, sorry, and that was very difficult to find a word for animals that exist on their own as a collective noun, obviously because you would just call it a boar, but it was important for us to change one to another. So what we did was we created a 1, 2 and 3, where we had a singular was what we were going to use for boar, but I felt that it was too near to. So anyway, before I do that, first of all, 2 became a brace. 2 became brace, and 3 became lease, which was a lease of hawks or a brace of rabbits. So we kind of created this sort of strange animal kind of system for numbers that were trying to be completely away from a hierarchy of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they would exist. Like you'd have a squadron of birds that were sort of 7, but they would have nothing to do with the sequence of numbers, but just to do with some sort of really sort of basic patchwork of reality that you would build up as this Neanderthal man.
So in a way, you were it brought into relief even more strongly this idea that you could apply numbers to themselves when you used as numbers these very concretely anchored. These things which are anchored in reality, and which, as you can see by the multiplication table in the corner there, when you multiply braces and lease, you get these kind of absurd clusters of words which.
Really the first point, I suppose, is when you're going to twoing something.
Yeah.
It's the act of multiplication. Is the act of, so if you're going to time something by 2, you're actually you're twoing something,
yeah.
or you're threeing something.
Yeah.
And so we were then swapping the word of twoing for the term bracing, and likewise the word of threeing became leasing. So it was, and then we created this grid of this table of things which Matthew filled in for me.
The important point, I mean, we were getting quite whimsical. I think it's been a long week.
Well, I think that it's worth dwelling on that just for a moment, is that this is kind of the next episode when in this tug of war the rope got pulled the other way. And I think, Conrad was getting really excited and Matthew was saying, well, I'm not quite sure about this. I think you see this a little bit in the film. But I think gradually we began to warm to the menagerie, didn't we?
Yeah, we were touching on the same thing. And the point is, if you've got a specific word, and I've read a little bit of ethnomathematics, where ethnographers or records of early encounters with indigenous peoples from various parts of the world have recorded various words for numbers or various people's dealings with numbers.